Hello there and welcome to Mysteries Beneath Earth, where curiosity takes a slow breath and science wanders gently through questions that feel both strange and strangely familiar. Tonight, we are going to turn our eyes away from the stars and away from the ruins we can see, the crumbling temples of the jungle, the buried stones of the desert, and look toward the one place on this planet that keeps its secrets most aggressively. We are going to look south. Not just to the edge of the map, but to the bottom of the world, to Antarctica. When you think of Antarctica, you probably picture a single, static image. A white wasteland, perhaps a penguin standing lonely against a blizzard, or the towering blue cliff of an ice shelf breaking off into the sea. It feels like a place that has always been this way. Frozen, empty, hostile to life. It feels like a blank page at the end of the book of Earth, a margin where nothing is written because nothing can be written. But tonight, I want you to drift with me into a different kind of thought. What if that whiteness is not emptiness? What if it is a blanket, a heavy, crushing, miles-thick layer of silence that has been pulled over a history we have completely forgotten? The question we are asking is simple, yet it carries a weight that makes the mind reel. What if the ruins of the first great civilization, or perhaps a version of Earth's history we have never met, are not lost in space, but are waiting right here, preserved in the deep freeze beneath the Antarctic ice? Before we begin to unpack the science and the speculation of this idea, let's take a moment to settle in. Where are you tonight? Maybe the house is quiet, the lights are low. Maybe you can hear the wind outside your own window, a faint echo of the gales that scour the polar plateau. Wherever you are, let this be a space of calm, a place where we can suspend our disbelief for a moment and let the sheer scale of geological time wash over us. To understand the possibility of something hidden beneath Antarctica, we first have to understand the great eraser we talked about in previous nights. We know that Earth recycles itself. Rain washes mountains into the sea. Tectonic plates subduct continents into the mantle. Forests grow over cities until the stones are pulled apart by roots. Most of the planet is a machine designed to destroy memory. But ice is different. Ice is a paradox. It is both a destroyer and a preserver. On one hand, glaciers are nature's bulldozers. As a glacier moves even just a few centimeters a day, it acts like a coarse sandpaper, grinding the bedrock beneath it into fine flour. It snaps trees, crushes boulders, and scours the land down to the bone. If a city were sitting on a mountaintop and a glacier rolled over it, the buildings would be pulverized, their foundations erased, their existence turned to dust. In this sense, the ice sheet is the ultimate eraser, a white, clean slate that wipes away everything that came before. But on the other hand, ice is a time capsule. It is the best preservative we know. Think of the woolly mammoths found in the Siberian permafrost. They aren't stone statues or mineralized bones. They are flesh and fur, preserving the very contents of their stomachs, the air in their lungs, the DNA in their cells. They look as if they died yesterday, yet they have been waiting for tens of thousands of years. Antarctica is this paradox multiplied by a factor of millions. The ice sheet there is not just a thin glaze. It is a monument to pressure and time. On average, the ice is over 1 mile thick. In its deepest basins, it plunges to nearly 3 miles, over 4,700 meters of solid, compressed water resting on top of the land. Imagine that for a moment. Imagine standing in London or New York or Tokyo. Now imagine looking up. Imagine a wall of ice rising not just above the skyscrapers, not just above the clouds, but reaching up into the stratosphere. A weight so immense that it has actually pushed the continental crust of Antarctica down into the mantle, depressing the land like a heavy thumb pressing into a memory foam mattress. If you were to strip that ice away, the continent would spring back up, rising hundreds of meters in a geological rebound. But for now, it is pinned down, crushed, silenced. This ice has been there in some form for about 34 million years. That number is easy to say, but hard to feel. 34 million years. That is long before humans walked the plains of Africa, long before the first stone tool was chipped, long before the ice ages that shaped Europe and North America. For 34 million years, the interior of Antarctica has been effectively cut off from the rest of the world. It is a sealed room. Whatever is down there, whatever landscapes, whatever river valleys, whatever fossils, or whatever else, has been locked away in the dark, pressed under gigatons of pressure, safe from the wind, safe from the rain, safe from the prying eyes of biology. This brings us to the core of our mystery. We assume Antarctica has always been a frozen wasteland because that is all we have ever known. In the brief flicker of human history, that 10,000-year blink, Antarctica has always been the white Mars. It was the last continent to be seen by human eyes, discovered only in 1820. It was the last to be walked upon. It remains the only continent with no indigenous human population. Because of this, we treat it as a blank backdrop, a stage where nothing happens. But geology tells a different story. It tells us that the ice is a recent accident. For the vast majority of Earth's history, for hundreds of millions of years, Antarctica was not white. It was green. It was teeming with life. It was a central hub of the supercontinent Gondwana, a bridge that connected South America to Australia, India to Africa. It was a place of forests, of rivers, of mountains that did not sleep under snow but rose into warm, rainy skies. If we are asking, what if a civilization is buried there? We are not asking for magic. We are asking a question of timing. We are asking, could intelligence have risen during those long, lush epochs before the ice fell? And if it did, if a society grew in those southern forests, perhaps thriving in the isolation of the polar circle, what would have happened when the climate turned? Would they have fled? Or would they have been trapped? The transition from green to white wasn't instantaneous, but in geological terms, it was a door slamming shut. The cold didn't just cover the land, it buried it. It took the rivers and froze them mid-flow. It took the forests and crushed them into the mud. And if there were cities, structures of stone, metal, or glass, it would have entombed them in a way that no desert sand or jungle vine ever could. Under the ice, there is no oxygen to rust metal. There is no flowing water to erode stone, mostly. There is only the dark, heavy stasis of the deep freeze.so. When we look at the map of Antarctica today, we are looking at a mask. We see the smooth, white contours of the surface, but that surface is a lie. It hides a jagged, complex, scarred landscape beneath. A landscape that is arguably the largest unexplored archaeological frontier on the planet. We have mapped the surface of Mars more accurately than we have mapped the bedrock of Antarctica. We know the craters of the moon better than we know the valleys hidden beneath the Ross ice shelf. We are standing on the roof of a house we have never entered, wondering who might have lived downstairs. Tonight, we are going to descend. We are going to peel back the layers of this white silence. We are going to look at the evidence that shows us just how alive this continent used to be. We are going to trace the movements of the tectonic plates that drifted this land into the solitary confinement of the pole. We are going to examine the strange maps that some claim show the coast before the ice. And we are going to look at the hard science, the ice cores, the radar scans, the magnetic anomalies that hint at things that don't quite fit the picture of a barren wasteland. It is a journey into the cold, yes. But it is also a journey into the imagination. Because to wonder what is beneath the ice is to wonder about the lost potential of our own planet. It is to acknowledge that Earth has forgotten more than we will ever learn. And as the wind howls across the katabatic slopes, dropping temperatures to 80 degrees below zero, remember this: the ice is excellent at keeping secrets. It doesn't volunteer information. It has to be drilled, melted, and coaxed. And even then, it only gives us a drop of water, a bubble of air, a tiny fragment of the past. But sometimes, a fragment is enough to rewrite history. So pull the blanket up a little tighter. Let the warmth of where you are contrast with the chill of where we are going. We are stepping onto the ice now. The horizon is flat and white in every direction. The silence is total. But beneath our feet, a mile down, the earth remembers something else. It remembers the time of green. And maybe, just maybe, it remembers us or something like us before the cold came down. If you were to stand in the center of Antarctica today at the South Pole itself, you would be standing on a desert of ice almost 2 miles thick. The air is so dry it cracks your skin. The temperature rarely rises above freezing, even in the height of summer. It is a place so hostile that for life to exist there, it must be microscopic, hidden in the pore spaces of rocks or dormant in the ice, waiting for a thaw that might not come for 1,000,000 years. It is hard, standing in that freezing desolation, to imagine the smell of damp soil, to imagine the sound of rain hitting broad leaves, to imagine the humidity of a swamp or the buzz of insects. But the earth remembers. And the memory of Antarctica is not white. It is a vibrant, deep, and tenacious green. To find this green Antarctica, we don't have to rely on science fiction. We just have to dial back the clock. We need to travel back to the Eocene epoch, roughly 50 million years ago. This is not, in the grand scheme of geology, a terribly long time. The dinosaurs were gone, wiped out by the asteroid 16 million years prior. The mammals were rising, taking their first tentative steps toward dominance. The planet was warmer, much warmer, than it is today. In this world, Antarctica was not an isolated icebox. It was a thriving continent, arguably the most pleasant place on Earth. Because the planet was in a greenhouse state, the equator was scorching hot, perhaps too hot for complex civilizations to thrive comfortably. But the poles? The poles were temperate. The poles were paradise. Scientists have found the proof of this paradise, and every time they find it, it shocks them. On Seymour Island, a finger of land off the Antarctic peninsula, paleontologists have dug into the frozen dirt and found a treasure trove of impossibility. They didn't find ice-scoured rocks. They found fossils of fern fronds. They found the preserved pollen of palm trees. They found the fossilized wood of the Nothofagus, the southern beech tree, which today grows in the rainy, temperate forests of Chile, New Zealand, and Tasmania. Think about that connection. The forests of New Zealand's Fiordland, those mossy, misty, green worlds that look like scenes from a fantasy movie, are the direct descendants of the forests that once covered Antarctica. If you want to know what the South Pole looked like 50 million years ago, go to a temperate rainforest. Breathe in the smell of decaying leaves and wet bark. That was Antarctica. But it wasn't just plants. A forest needs inhabitants, and the Eocene Antarctica was teeming with them. In 2011, scientists working on Seymour Island found a fossil that changed the picture again. It was a tiny ankle bone, tarsal, but to a trained eye, this bone spoke volumes. It belonged to a marsupial, a creature related to the possums and Manito del Monte that live in South America today. This meant that land animals were walking across Antarctica. They weren't just clinging to the coast. They were migrating through the interior. We have found evidence of giant birds, 6 feet tall, stalking through the ferns. We have found the remains of falcon-like raptors. We have found fossils of beetles and amphibians. During the Eocene, you could have walked from the tip of South America across a land bridge into the heart of Antarctica and possibly all the way to Australia without ever stepping on a glacier. You would have walked through dense canopies of green. You would have had to hack your way through undergrowth. You would have camped by rivers that flowed warm and silt-heavy into a sea that was teeming with fish. The temperature? In the summer, the coast of Antarctica would have been around 15 degrees Celsius, nearly 60 degrees Fahrenheit. A pleasant spring day in London or Seattle. Even in the winter, it likely didn't freeze hard. It was a world of eternal green. But there was one catch, one thing that made this paradise strange, something that would have shaped the psychology of any civilization that lived there. The light. Antarctica was still at the pole. It was still subject to the tilt of the Earth, which meant that for 6 months of the year, the sun would not set. The green summer would be a time of endless productivity, the forests growing explosively in the perpetual twilight and daylight, the animals feasting around the clock. And then, the sun would dip below the horizon and refuse to rise. For 6 months, the continent would be plunged into the green winter. But because the climate was so warm, this wasn't a winter of snow and ice. It was a winter of darkness and rain. Imagine a rainforest in total darkness. The air is still warm, perhaps 5 or 10 degrees Celsius. The trees don't lose their leaves. They are evergreens, adapted to low light. But the world is pitch black, illuminated only by the moon, the stars, and the southern lights, the aurora australis, dancing overhead. This unique environment, a warm, dark polar forest, has no equivalent on Earth today. It is an extinct ecosystem. Now, bring the what if into this picture. If intelligent life was evolving on Earth during this window, or if a civilization arrived here, where would they go? The equator is boiling hot. The northern continents are broken and shifting. But Antarctica? Antarctica is a massive, stable, resource-rich continent with a mild climate and a natural defense mechanism. Isolation. A civilization developing here would be unlike any we know. They would be masters of the dark. They would adapt to the rhythm of the 6-month night. Their architecture, their agriculture, their sleep cycles, everything would be tuned to this binary year of light and shadow. They would have access to the same resources we built our world on. We know there is coal in Antarctica, vast seams of it in the transantarctic mountains. Coal is just fossilized ancient forest. The very existence of coal proves the forests were there. They would have had access to minerals, to fresh water, to the ocean. And the silence of the fossil record? We talked earlier about how rare fossils are. But in a rainforest environment, they are even rarer. The acidic soil of a jungle eats bones. It breaks down ruins. If a civilization built with wood, which would be abundant, Their cities would rot away in centuries, leaving nothing but soil. But what if they built with stone? What if they built with something stronger? The reason we haven't found them on Seymour Island, where we found the marsupials, might be because Seymour Island was the fringe. It was the edge of the continent. If you were building a great civilization, you wouldn't build it on the stormy tip of a peninsula. You would build it in the interior. You would build it in the deep valleys protected by mountains. You would build it by the Great Lakes that we now know exist deep beneath the ice. We haven't found traces of them because the places they would have lived are now buried under 3 miles of ice. The green Antarctica is the basement of the white Antarctica. The transition between these two worlds is one of the most violent climatic shifts in Earth's history. It is called the Eocene-Oligocene extinction event. About 34 million years ago, the CO2 levels dropped. The continents drifted apart. The Drake Passage opened, allowing the ocean to circle Antarctica, cutting it off from the warm currents of the north. The temperature plummeted. The rain turned to snow. The snow didn't melt, piled up year after year, century after century. The forests were not just killed, they were buried. The crushing weight of the ice began to accumulate that if anyone was there, they would have watched their world end in slow motion. The endless summer grew shorter. The dark winter grew colder. The glaciers began to creep down from the mountains, consuming the valleys, toppling the trees, burying the cities. They would have had to leave, or perhaps they retreated underground, seeking the warmth of the earth as the surface became uninhabitable. Today, when drillers pull up cores from the sea floor around Antarctica, they find layers of pollen and spores from this green age. They find the chemical signature of a world that was alive. The green Antarctica is not a myth. It is a scientific fact. The only myth is the idea that it was empty. We assume it was empty because we are the only intelligence we know. But standing in the ghost of that temperate rainforest, with the aurora overhead and the smell of pine in the dark air, it is hard not to wonder if someone else stood there too, looking up at the same sky, unaware that the ice was coming to claim it all. So we have the place. A habitable, resource-rich continent hidden by history. And we have the motive, a paradise before the freeze. But how did it get there? And how did it get so cold? To understand that, we have to understand the drift. The great, slow voyage that took Antarctica from the center of the world to the bottom of it. And that is where we will go next, to the breakup of the supercontinents and the lonely journey of the land that would become the tomb of the ancient world. When we look at a map of the world, we tend to see it as a finished painting. The continents sit where they sit. North America up here, Africa over there, Australia down under, and Antarctica isolated at the bottom. We treat these positions as permanent addresses. But geology teaches us that a map is not a painting. It is a single frame in a very long, very slow, and very violent movie. To understand why Antarctica became the tomb of the ancient world, we have to rewind that movie. We have to go back to a time when the concept of isolation didn't exist for the southern lands. We have to go back to Gondwana. Gondwana was the great supercontinent of the south. It was a massive assembly of land that included what is now South America, Africa, Arabia, Madagascar, India, Australia, and New Zealand. And right in the center of this colossal gathering, the heart pumping blood to all the other limbs, was Antarctica. It wasn't at the pole then. It was further north, bathed in warmer currents. But more importantly, it was the bridge. If you were a dinosaur in the Cretaceous or an early mammal in the Paleocene, You didn't need a boat to get from Sydney to Santiago. You could walk. You would walk through the lush rift valleys of Antarctica. It was the grand central station of the southern hemisphere. If a civilization had arisen during this time, or if one had settled there, they wouldn't have been cut off from the world. They would have been at the center of it. They would have controlled the trade routes of biology, the migration paths of species. They would have occupied the most strategic real estate on the planet. But then, the engine of the Earth began to turn against them. The breakup of a supercontinent is not a quiet event. It is a geological trauma. It happens over millions of years, but it is punctuated by earthquakes that would level modern cities, volcanic eruptions that darken skies for decades, and the tearing of the very crust of the planet. First, Africa broke away, drifting north. Then India tore itself loose and raced across the ocean to crash into Asia, raising the Himalayas. But for a long time, the big three of the South America, Australia, and Antarctica held together. They were the last survivors of the family. Then came the separation. Australia began to pull away to the north, moving sluggishly at the speed of fingernail growth. As it ripped away from Antarctica, a new ocean flooded in between them. The Southern Ocean began to form. This was the first wall of the prison being built. But the most critical moment, the moment that sealed Antarctica's fate, was the separation from South America. For millions of years, a thin finger of land, an isthmus, connected the Antarctic peninsula to the tip of Patagonia. This land bridge blocked the flow of the oceans. It forced the warm waters from the equator to flow down the coast of South America, wrap around Antarctica, and keep the continent warm. It was a hot water bottle pressed against the bottom of the world. As long as that bridge held, Antarctica could stay green. As long as that bridge held, a civilization could survive there, protected by the warm currents. But plate tectonics is relentless. The plates pulled, the crust thinned, and roughly 34 to 40 million years ago, the bridge snapped. It wasn't just a land bridge collapsing. It was the opening of a floodgate. The Drake Passage was born. This is one of the most significant events in the history of Earth's climate. When that gap opened between South America and Antarctica, the ocean currents changed forever. Suddenly, there was nothing stopping the water from flowing all the way around the bottom of the world. The Antarctic Circumpolar Current, ACC, began to spin. Imagine a river in the ocean, wider than any continent, deeper than any canyon, flowing endlessly from west to east, circling Antarctica like a protective or trapping ring. This current is the strongest on Earth. It moves 130 million cubic meters of water per second. When the ACC started up, it did something devastating. It created a thermal barrier. It cut Antarctica off from the warm, tropical waters of the north. It became a force field. Warm water tried to come south, but the ACC pushed it back. Antarctica was no longer part of the global heat exchange. It was locked in a room by itself. This is where the what if becomes haunting. If there was a civilization on Antarctica at this time, perhaps the green engineers we imagined earlier, they would have felt this shift not as a sudden freeze, but as a sudden isolation. The ships that might have traveled to South America or Australia would have found the seas becoming wilder, the storms becoming impassable. The Drake Passage is known today as the roughest stretch of ocean on the planet, a graveyard for sailors. When it opened, it would have been a chaotic churn of violent new currents. Any maritime trade would have ceased. Any migration routes would have been severed. The people of the continent would have watched their neighbors drift away over the horizon. Quite literally, they were now alone. The drift had turned their home from a bridge into an island at the bottom of the world. And because of the circumpolar current, that island began to cool. The Great Drift wasn't just about geography. It was about destiny. It took a habitable central continent and pushed it into the solitary confinement of the polar circle. It surrounded it with a moat of freezing, violent water. And then, once the trap was set, the temperature began to drop. From the perspective of a hypothetical lost civilization, this would have been a slow-motion crisis. At first, the winters just got a little longer. The green winter of darkness became a white winter of snow. The snow that used to melt by midsummer started to linger in the high valleys. The glaciers in the Transantarctic mountains began to grow, creeping down like white tongues, tasting the forests below. They wouldn't have known that the continents were moving. They wouldn't have known about the Drake Passage or the circumpolar current. They would have only known that the world was turning against them. The gods of the harvest were failing. The sun seemed to have lost its warmth. But they were trapped. With the oceans becoming impassable walls of storm and ice, there was no evacuation fleet. There was no mass migration to warmer lands. The drift had locked the doors. This isolation is key to the theory of a forgotten civilization. If they had been able to leave, they would have brought their culture, their technology, their stories to South America or Australia. We would find traces of them in the archaeology of Patagonia or Tasmania. We would see a sudden influx of advanced refugees in the fossil record. But we don't. And the reason might be the ACC. The drift didn't just freeze them, it quarantined them. Whatever happened in Antarctica stayed in Antarctica. The rise, the fall, the struggle against the cold. It all played out in a sealed theater with no audience. It is fascinating to look at the geology of the Transantarctic mountains today. These are mountains that were uplifted during this very period of rifting. As the continent stretched and groaned, these peaks rose up. If you were there, you would have seen volcanoes erupting along the rift lines. Mount Erebus is a lingering reminder of this activity. You would have seen a landscape that was geographically spectacular. High jagged peaks, active volcanoes, deep rift valleys filled with lakes, and a coastline that was slowly being besieged by sea ice. It was a dramatic stage for a tragedy. The Great Drift explains the where and the why of the isolation, but it doesn't fully explain the how of the erasure. For that, we need to look at the atmosphere. We need to look at the chemistry of the air, because while the continents were moving, something else was happening globally. An invisible blanket was being stripped away from the Earth. Carbon dioxide levels were crashing. The isolation of Antarctica was the trigger, but the atmosphere was the bullet. And when those two things combined, the result was the big freeze. So we leave the drifting continents behind. We leave the widening oceans. We turn our attention to the land itself, where the first snowflakes are starting to fall, snowflakes that will not melt for 30 million years. Snowflakes that will become the bricks of the tomb. Let's walk forward into the cold. The end of a world rarely happens all at once. In movies, it's an explosion, a tidal wave, a sudden cut to black. But in the reality of geology, and perhaps in the reality of lost histories, the end is often a long, slow, suffocating embrace. We are now at the boundary of the Eocene and Oligocene epochs, roughly 34 million years ago. The Drake Passage is open. The cold current is circling. Antarctica is isolated, but it is not yet dead. There are still forests on the coast. There are still rivers flowing into the sea. Life is clinging on, adapting to the cooling temperatures. If a civilization is there, they are likely huddled in the refugia, the warm pockets, the geothermal valleys, the sheltered coastlines. They are surviving. But then, the feedback loop begins. The big freeze is one of the most frightening mechanisms Earth possesses. It starts with a simple principle, albedo. This is a measure of how much sunlight a surface reflects. A dark forest has low albedo. It absorbs heat, keeping the land warm. A deep blue ocean absorbs heat. But snow, ice, they are white. They act like mirrors. They reflect the sun's energy back into space. As Antarctica cooled due to its isolation, the first permanent snowfields began to form on the highest peaks of the Gamburtsev Mountains and the Transantarctic Range. At first, they were just white caps on the mountains. But because they were white, they cooled the air around them. The cold air flowed down the mountains, freezing the rain in the valleys, turning it to snow. The snow covered the dark forests. The land became whiter. Because it was whiter, it reflected more heat. Because it reflected more heat, it got colder. Because it got colder, it snowed more. This is the runaway icehouse effect. Once it tips past a certain point, it cannot be stopped. It is a chain reaction of cold. For the biology of the continent, this was a horror story. We can see the panic in the fossil record. The broad-leafed plants, the ferns that loved the warmth, vanish abruptly. They are replaced by Nothofagus, the southern beech, which is tougher, more resistant to cold. Then even the beech trees start to stunt. They grow smaller, gnarled, twisted by the biting wind. Then they disappear from the interior entirely, pushed to the very edges of the sea. Finally, they are replaced by tundra, mosses, lichens. The landscape shifts from a lush Amazon-like jungle to a Siberian tundra in a geological blink of an eye. Now, place our hypothetical civilization in this shifting landscape. How does a society react when the glaciers start to eat their world? Initially, it would be a problem of engineering. The rivers freeze. You build aqueducts from the geothermal springs. The crops fail. You move agriculture into greenhouses or fungal caves. The winters get too cold. You build deeper, thicker walls. You burn more coal. We know they had coal. Antarctica has some of the largest coal reserves on the planet. It is likely that as the cold descended, any intelligent species would have turned to that black rock for salvation. They would have burned it to keep the lights on during the 6-month night. They would have burned it to melt the encroaching ice. It's a cruel irony to imagine. A civilization burning fossil fuels not to drive industry, but simply to hold back an ice age that was inevitable. But the ice is relentless. It doesn't just freeze, it flows. Glaciers are heavy. As they thickened, they began to slide out of the mountains. A glacier is a river of solid rock-hard ice. It moves with irresistible force. If a city stands in its path, the glacier does not go around. It goes through. It topples walls, grinds stone to powder, and carries the debris along with it for hundreds of miles, eventually dumping it into the ocean as drop stones. However, there is a nuance here that gives hope to the forgotten ruins hypothesis. Not all ice acts like a grinder. There is a phenomenon known as cold-based ice. When the temperature drops very low very quickly, the ice can become frozen to the bedrock. Instead of sliding and grinding, it sticks, creates a protective seal. A cold-based ice sheet can sit on top of a landscape for millions of years without eroding it at all. It preserves the topography perfectly, like a fly trapped in amber. We know this happens. In parts of the dry valleys of Antarctica today, we have found ancient landscapes preserved under cold-based ice that haven't changed in 14 million years. The ice didn't destroy them. It embalmed them. So, the question becomes, did the big freeze happen fast enough to flash freeze the civilization? Or was it slow enough to grind it to dust? The Eocene-Oligocene transition was rapid. In just a few 100,000 years, a snap of the fingers for Earth, global temperatures plunged. The ice sheets expanded explosively. It is entirely possible that vast regions of the Antarctic interior were covered in this protective, cold-based ice. If a civilization retreated into the deep valleys, or if they had built subterranean networks to escape the cold, the ice might have simply sealed the entrances. Imagine a city in a rift valley. The snow piles up. The buildings are buried. The weight presses down. The roofs might collapse, but the footprints, the foundations, the artifacts, the roads, they are locked in a freezer that never loses power. There is no rust because there is no liquid water. There is no rot because there are no microbes active in the deep freeze. There is only stasis. This is the great preservation. While the rest of the world moved on, while mammals grew large in Africa, while apes stood up, while humans invented fire and the wheel, Antarctica stopped. It held its breath. The big freeze also changed the atmosphere. As the ice sheet grew, it locked up massive amounts of fresh water. Sea levels around the world dropped. The chemistry of the oceans changed. But for those left behind on the continent, the world became very small. The ice pushed them to the coastlines, and then the sea ice expanded, pushing them further. Did they die out? This is the most likely answer. The great filter of the cold was simply too strong. No biological entity can survive the transition from a rainforest to a polar plateau without technology far beyond what we assume they had. But dying out and disappearing are two different things. A civilization can die, but its shell remains. If we lay the timeline of the big freeze over the timeline of human history, it puts our own fragility in perspective. We worry about a few degrees of warming. They faced a drop of 20 degrees. We worry about rising seas. They faced a solid ocean crushing them from above. The big freeze was the curtain falling on the first act of Antarctica. When the curtain rose again, for the explorers of the 19th and 20th centuries, the stage was empty. The green was gone. The animals were gone. There was only the white silence. But ghosts have a way of showing up where they aren't supposed to be. And sometimes they show up on maps. As we move forward in our investigation, we have to leave the geological deep time and step into the murky waters of human history. Because there are maps, strange, impossible maps drawn by admirals and scholars hundreds of years ago, that claim to show Antarctica without the ice. How could a medieval sailor know the shape of a coastline that had been buried for 34 million years? Is it a coincidence? Is it a fantasy? Or is it a whisper from someone who remembered? That is the mystery of the Piri Reis map, and that is where we turn our lantern next. Into the library of impossible geography. History is usually written in ink, carved in stone, or printed in books. But sometimes, history is hidden in the things that shouldn't exist. It hides in the anomalies, the out-of-place artifacts that sit quietly in museums, defying our understanding of the timeline. When we ask whether a civilization could have known about Antarctica before the ice took it completely, We eventually find ourselves standing in the dusty archives of the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, staring at a piece of gazelle skin that has troubled historians for nearly 100 years. We are talking, of course, about the Piri Reis map. Drawn in 1513 by the Ottoman admiral and cartographer Piri Reis, this map is a masterpiece of naval art. It is beautiful, covered in delicate illustrations of ships, animals, and kings, with rum lines radiating out in the style of a portolan chart used for navigation. Piri Reis himself wrote in the margins that he did not survey the world himself. Instead, he acted as a compiler. He claimed to have used 20 older source maps, some dating back to the time of Alexander the Great, and some, according to the notes, captured from the ships of Christopher Columbus. For centuries, the map was just a historical curiosity. But in the 20th century, eyes began to drift to the bottom edge of the parchment. The map shows the coast of Brazil and the eastern curve of South America with remarkable accuracy for the time. But then, instead of ending at Cape Horn, the coastline continues. It curves eastward, wrapping around the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. It shows a landmass where no landmass should be, at least not according to the history books of 1513. Official history tells us Antarctica was discovered in 1820 by Russian, British, and American sailors sighting the ice shelf. Yet, here is a map drawn 300 years earlier showing a southern coast. But the mystery goes deeper than just the date. It is about what the map depicts. The coastline on the Piri Reis map is not a straight line of ice. It shows bays, inlets, and what appear to be dry land features. In the 1960s, a professor named Charles Hapgood, captivated by this anomaly, proposed a theory that sent shockwaves through the fringe of academia. He suggested that the Piri Reis map didn't just show Antarctica. It showed Antarctica before the ice. He argued that the coastal profile matched the subglacial topography of Queen Maud Land, a region of Antarctica now buried under a mile of ice. Hapgood even corresponded with the U.S. Air Force. In a letter that has since become famous in mystery circles, a Commander Harold Z. Onizer from the 8th Reconnaissance Technical Squadron wrote back to Hapgood, stating that the map's coastline agreed with the seismic profile of the area to a remarkable degree. The letter concluded that the data indicates the coastline has been mapped before it was covered by the ice cap. Let's pause and feel the weight of that suggestion. If it were true, it would break our timeline. The ice over Queen Maud Land is not recent. It has been there for millions of years. For a human map to show that coast ice-free, the source maps Piri Reis used would have to date back to an antiquity so deep it predates the human species, or our understanding of the ice's age is fundamentally wrong. Critics, of course, have a more grounded explanation. They argue that Piri Reis ran out of parchment. They suggest that when he reached the bottom of South America, he simply bent the coastline of Patagonia eastward to fit it on the page. They point out that the Antarctica on the map is connected to South America, which we know is geographically incorrect today, though they were once connected in the deep geological past. They argue that this is not a memory of the ice-free South, but a combination of drawing error and the ancient Greek theory of terra australis incognita. The Greeks, specifically Aristotle, believed that there had to be a massive continent in the south to balance the weight of the continents in the north. Without it, they thought the earth would topple over. So, for centuries, cartographers drew a massive, imaginary land at the bottom of the world just to satisfy a sense of planetary symmetry. But the Piri Reis map is not alone. There is also the map of Orontius Phineas, drawn in 1531. This map is even more startling. It shows the entire continent of Antarctica positioned correctly at the pole. but it doesn't look like the white blob we see on Google Earth. The Orontius Phineus map shows mountain ranges along the coasts. It shows rivers, clearly drawn, meandering rivers, flowing from the interior mountains down into the sea. Rivers. On Antarctica. Today, we know those valleys exist. We know those riverbeds are there, but they are buried under thousands of meters of ice. They are paleorivers, ghosts of a hydrological system that hasn't flowed for 30 million years. How could Orontius Phineus, a French mathematician sitting in a library in the 16th century, draw rivers that no human eye had seen since the Eocene epoch? He, too, claimed to be working from ancient source maps. This brings us back to the ghosts in the cartography. Are these maps simply lucky guesses? Is it just pareidolia, the human tendency to see patterns where none exist? Are we looking at a bent South America and desperate to see a lost civilization? Or is it possible that the Great Eraser missed a spot? Consider the transmission of knowledge. We know that the Library of Alexandria held hundreds of thousands of scrolls before it burned. We know that the ancients possessed knowledge of geometry and astronomy that was lost for 1,000 years during the Dark Ages. Is it conceivable that among those lost scrolls were copies of copies of copies? Maps passed down from a time when the ice was not yet absolute. It is a staggering thought. It implies that there was a maritime civilization capable of mapping the globe at a time when science tells us humans were barely making stone tools. Or, even more radically, that the ice is younger than we think. Geologists are firm on the age of the ice. The isotopes don't lie. The ice is millions of years old. This makes the ancient map theory scientifically impossible in the conventional timeline. And yet, the maps sit there. They look back at us with their ink lines and their impossible rivers. They are like whispers in a crowded room. You can't quite make out the words, and you can't find who spoke them, but you know you heard something. Perhaps the truth is somewhere in the middle. Perhaps these maps are not perfect GPS records, but distorted memories. Maybe early human explorers thousands of years ago, long before Columbus or Cook, did sail south. Maybe they reached the edge of the ice when it was slightly retreated during a warm interglacial period. Maybe they saw the tops of mountains that are now buried or the mouths of valleys that are now glaciers. Or maybe, just maybe, the source maps Piri Reis mentioned came from the first civilization we are hypothesizing. A civilization that lived on the continent before the freeze, who mapped their home not as a mystery, but as a neighborhood. When we look at the Piri Reis map, we are looking at an artifact of the what if. It is a piece of paper that refuses to fit neatly into the box of history. It forces us to ask, how much of the past has been forgotten? And how much of it is hiding in plain sight, rolled up in archives, mistaken for fantasy? But maps are only drawings. They can be dismissed as art or error. To find something harder to dismiss, we have to look for something more solid. We have to look for things that are too big to be drawn and too massive to be moved. We have to look beneath the ice itself, to the physical landscape that has been hidden for eons. And in 1958, a team of Soviet explorers found exactly that. They found a ghost range, a set of mountains that shouldn't exist, standing tall in the eternal dark of the subglacial world. Let's roll up the parchment. Let's leave the library. We are going back to the ice, to the pole of inaccessibility, to find the mountains of the mind. In the world of geography, mountains are usually the most obvious things on the planet. You cannot hide the Himalayas. You cannot misplace the Rockies. They tear through the clouds, visible for hundreds of miles. defining the weather and the horizon. They are the jagged bones of the Earth, thrust up for everyone to see. But in Antarctica, the rules of geography are suspended. In Antarctica, it is possible to hide a mountain range the size of the European Alps completely from view. This is the story of the Gamburtsev subglacial mountains, and they are perhaps the most baffling geological feature on Earth. Their discovery dates back to the height of the Cold War. It was 1958, the International Geophysical Year. A team of Soviet explorers was making a grueling traverse across the East Antarctic ice sheet. They were headed for the pole of inaccessibility, the point on the continent furthest from any ocean. The hardest place on Earth to reach. It was a journey into the white void. The temperatures hovered around -50 degrees Celsius. The landscape was a flat, featureless plateau of blinding snow. To the naked eye, it looked like an infinite, flat, frozen ocean. But the Soviets weren't just looking with their eyes. They were listening to the Earth. They were setting off seismic charges, explosions, and measuring how long it took for the sound waves to bounce off the bedrock buried deep below the ice. For hundreds of miles, the echo came back as expected. A flat continent, depressed by the weight of the ice. And then something changed. The echoes started coming back faster, and faster, and faster. Beneath the flat white surface, the ground was rising. It wasn't just a hill, it was a wall. The explorers realized with shock that they were driving their tractors over the peaks of a massive mountain range. These were the Gamburtsevs. They stretch for 1,200 kilometers, roughly the same length as the Alps in Europe. Their peaks rise up to 2,700 meters, nearly 9,000 feet, but they are buried under 600 meters of ice. In the valleys between them, the ice is over 3,000 meters thick. If you could magically lift the ice away, you would see a landscape as dramatic as Switzerland or the Yosemite Valley. You would see sharp, jagged peaks, deep river valleys, and plunging cliffs. But here is the mystery. They shouldn't be there. Geologically, East Antarctica is a craton. It is an ancient, stable piece of continental crust, billions of years old. Cratons are usually flat, worn down by eons of erosion. Think of the flat expanses of Australia or the Canadian Shield. Mountains usually form where tectonic plates crash together, like the Himalayas or the Andes. But the Gamburtsevs are in the middle of the plate. There is no collision zone. And then there is the erosion paradox. We talked earlier about the Great Eraser. Glaciers are supposed to grind mountains down. The Gamburtsevs have been covered in ice for at least 34 million years. By all the laws of geology, the ice should have sanded these peaks into smooth, round hills long ago. But the radar images show something else. They show peaks that are sharp, valleys that are V-shaped like river valleys, not U-shaped like glacial valleys. They look young. They look untouched. How is this possible? In 2009, a major international project called AGAP, Antarctica's Gamburtsev province, flew aircraft equipped with ice-penetrating radar back and forth over the range. They created a 3D map of this ghost world. What they found was the frozen rose theory. They discovered that the ice at the bottom, in the deep valleys, isn't moving. It is frozen solid to the rock. It is cold-based ice. Instead of grinding the mountains, the ice encased them in a protective shell. It effectively stopped time. The sharp peaks we see on the radar are the same peaks that stood there 34 million years ago. They are a perfectly preserved snapshot of the Eocene Earth. Now, Let's bring the first civilization back into this frozen valley. If you were looking for a place to hide a history, you could not design a better vault than the Gamburtsevs. These mountains offer something that the flat plains do not: refugia. The radar scans revealed that the valleys are incredibly deep. And at the bottom of these valleys, deep in the cradle of the mountains, the pressure of the ice is so immense that it melts the water at the base. There are lakes down there. We will talk about the lakes in detail later, but in the context of the mountains, this is crucial. A mountain range provides geothermal heat. The crust is often thinner or fractured under mountains. We suspect that the Gamburtsevs might be sitting over a hotspot in the mantle, which is what uplifted them in the first place. Heat plus water plus protection. In the early stages of the Big Freeze, when the rest of the continent was becoming a wind-blown hell, the valleys of the Gamburtsevs might have been the last strongholds. As the ice sheet closed over the top of the peaks, forming a roof, is it possible that the valleys below remained hollow for a time? Or perhaps, as the civilization realized the end was coming, they used these deep geothermal valleys as the foundations for something that could endure. Imagine a city built not on the surface, but into the cliffs of a deep rift valley. As the snow piled up, it didn't crush the city directly. It bridged over the peaks first. For centuries, they might have lived in a subglacial pocket, a world of twilight powered by the heat of the earth, protected by the growing roof of ice above. Eventually, of course, the ice filled it all in. The weight became too much. The silence claimed the Gamburtsevs. But because of the cold-based preservation, the ruins of such a place would not be ground to dust. They wouldn't be scattered like the debris of a normal glacier. They would be locked in place. If there are structures in those valleys, stone foundations, carved caves, metallic artifacts, they are sitting there right now, exactly where they were left. The Gamburtsev Mountains are the ultimate tease of the Antarctic mystery. We know they are there. We know what they look like. We know they are preserved, but we cannot reach them. They are more inaccessible to us than the surface of Mars. To dig down to the floor of a Gamburtsev valley would require a drilling project costing billions, battling temperatures that freeze hydraulic fluid and shatter steel, so they wait. They are the mountains of the mind because for now, we can only explore them with our imagination and our radar echoes. They are the ghostly backbone of a lost continent, holding up the ice sheet like a tent pole, and in the pockets of water that sit at their feet, in the dark, pressurized lakes that connect these hidden valleys, another possibility stirs. If the mountains are the tomb, the lakes might be the aquarium. The ice sealed the continent, yes, but it also sealed the water. And water, as we know, is the one thing that life refuses to give up. Next, we are going to descend from the peaks of the Gamburtsevs into the depths of the time capsules. We are going to visit Lake Vostok and the subglacial network, where water has been cut off from the sun for 15 million years, and where something is still waiting in the dark. Water is the blood of the earth. It flows, it evaporates, it rains, it returns to the sea. It is the ultimate traveler, constantly recycling itself through the atmosphere and the oceans, touching every continent and every era. The water in your glass right now might have once been in a dinosaur's bloodstream, or in a cloud over ancient Rome, or deep in the Pacific Trench. Water remembers because it moves. But in Antarctica, there is water that has forgotten how to move. There is water that has been locked in a solitary cell for 15 million years. We are descending now from the peaks of the buried Gamburtsev Mountains into the valleys below. And here, crushed beneath 3 miles of ice, we find the time capsules. We find the subglacial lakes. For a long time, scientists assumed that the base of the Antarctic ice sheet was a frozen seal. ice welded to rock, solid all the way down. But in the 1970s, and more clearly in the 1990s using satellite radar altimetry, they noticed something strange. On the surface of the ice, which is usually flat or gently sloping, they found large, completely flat depressions, like the skin of a drum pulled tight. When they fired radar waves down into these flat spots, the echo changed. It didn't bounce off rock. It bounced off a liquid interface. They realized with astonishment that beneath the coldest place on Earth, there was liquid water. Lots of it.to date, we have mapped over 400 subglacial lakes beneath Antarctica. They are kept liquid by the immense pressure of the ice above, which lowers the freezing point of water, and the geothermal heat radiating up from the Earth's core below. It is a delicate balance, a blanket of ice trapping the warmth of the planet to create a hidden hydrosphere. The largest of these, and the most famous, is Lake Vostok. Lake Vostok is a monster. It is roughly the size of Lake Ontario in North America. It is 250 kilometers long and 50 kilometers wide. In some places, it is over 1,000 meters deep, and it is buried beneath 4,000 meters, 4 kilometers, of solid ice. Let's sit with the reality of Lake Vostok for a moment. This is a body of water that has not seen sunlight, has not felt the wind, and has not touched the atmosphere for at least 15 million years. It is the definition of isolation. But it is not just a dark pool. It is an extreme environment that challenges our understanding of biology and physics. The water in Lake Vostok is supersaturated with oxygen, perhaps 50 times more oxygen than a normal lake, because the glacier above slowly melts and releases trapped air bubbles into the water. The pressure is immense, over 350 times the atmospheric pressure at sea level. It is pitch black. It is cold, hovering just below 0 degrees Celsius. It is crushing, and yet we believe it is alive. Drilling projects by Russian scientists, who have painstakingly bored down toward the lake over decades, have stopped just short of breaching it to avoid contamination, though they have retrieved refrozen accretion ice. In those samples, they found genetic traces of microbes, extremophiles, bacteria that eat minerals, that thrive in the dark, that live on the energy of the rock itself. Now, apply the Silurian Hypothesis to Lake Vostok. Apply the what if. If a civilization existed on Antarctica before the freeze, the Vostok Basin would have been a prime location. It would have been a massive, deep rift valley lake, teeming with fish, surrounded by the lush Eocene forests we talked about earlier. It would have been the heart of the continent's water system. When the ice came, the lake didn't freeze solid. It was capped. If there were structures on the shores of that ancient lake, ports, settlements, research stations, what happened to them? The rising water levels as the ice cap pressed down might have submerged them. But unlike the surface, where glaciers grind everything to dust, the environment of the subglacial lake is surprisingly gentle. There are currents in Lake Vostok driven by the heat of the earth, but they are slow. The water is still. It is a dark, silent cathedral. If artifacts sank into Lake Vostok 15 million years ago, they would be resting in the sediment at the bottom today, preserved in the high-pressure, dark, oxygen-rich water. There is also the question of energy. We know the lake stays liquid because of geothermal heat. There are likely hydrothermal vents at the bottom of Vostok, similar to the black smokers we see in the deep ocean. If an ancient intelligence was facing the onset of the big freeze, where would they go? They would go to the heat. They might have clustered around these geothermal zones. As the surface became uninhabitable, the shores of the warming lakes might have been the last refuge. Some speculative thinkers have even suggested that if the lake is large enough and the energy source constant enough, a biosphere could have continued under the ice. Not just microbes, but something more complex. Blind fish? Pale crustaceans? Or something else that evolved in the 15 million years of isolation? We simply don't know. We have never sent a camera into Vostok. We have never taken a sample from the bottom sediments. It is a true terra incognita. But Vostok is just one of hundreds. There is a whole network down there. Recently, scientists discovered that these lakes are not isolated. They are connected. Rivers of liquid water flow beneath the ice sheet, draining from one lake to another. When the pressure changes, massive floods occur beneath the glacier, moving water hundreds of miles in the dark. This subglacial hydrological system means that Antarctica has a circulatory system. It is active. For our first civilization theory, this is crucial. It means that if evidence exists, it might not be where it was originally left. Artifacts could have been washed from the highlands into the deep basins. The trash of a lost society, the most durable evidence of all, could be collecting in the sedimentary traps of these lakes. But there is a darker side to the lakes. They are also traps for gases. We know that methane hydrates, frozen cages of methane gas, can build up in deep, cold water. If Vostok has been accumulating methane from decaying organic matter, the ancient forests, for millions of years, it is a ticking time bomb. If the ice were to melt or crack, that gas could be released. But for now, the seal holds. The time capsules of Antarctica are the most perfect preservation vaults on Earth. They beat the entropy we worry about. In the cold, dark, static environment of the subglacial world, entropy is slowed to a crawl. A piece of wood, a bone, a tool, a golden idol, dropped into the mud of Vostok millions of years ago, might still be there, waiting for a light that never comes. It is a haunting thought. An entire geography of lakes, rivers, and shores that exist parallel to our world, but separated by a wall of ice we cannot penetrate. We stand on the surface, shivering in the wind, while 2 miles below us, liquid waves lap gently against a shoreline of eternal night. But not all the mysteries are deep. Some are closer to the surface, and some involve not the civilization that might have been there before the ice, but the humans who might have seen the continent after the ice, but long before history admits it. We are leaving the lakes now. We are rising back up through the ice, past the millions of years of snow layers, to the surface of the ocean. We are going to look at the horizon. Because while Western history says Antarctica was found in 1820, the whispers of the Pacific Ocean tell a different story. They tell of a canoe that sailed into the white mist. They tell of a man named Uitiranjora. And that is where we turn our eyes next, to the human whisper. History, as it is taught in schools, is often a story of firsts claimed by men in tall ships with flags and gunpowder. We are told that Antarctica was a ghost continent, unseen by human eyes until the Russian Admiral Bellingshausen, the British Captain Bransfield, and the American sealer Palmer all spotted it within days of each other in 1820. But the ocean is older than the empires of Europe. And the people who lived on the ocean, the master navigators of the Pacific, were reading the stars and the waves thousands of years before the compass was invented in the West. When we ask if Antarctica holds the ruins of a lost civilization, we usually mean a civilization native to the continent from the deep past. But there is another possibility. What if the ruins belong to visitors? What if humans found Antarctica long ago, left their mark, and then fled? To find this story, we have to leave the history books and turn to oral tradition. We have to go to Rarotonga, in the Cook Islands. There is a legend there, passed down through generations of storytellers, about a Polynesian navigator named Uiti Iranjora. According to the oral history, roughly around the year 650 AD, more than 1,000 years before the first European sighting, Uiti Iranjora led a fleet of waka canoes south. Polynesian navigators were the astronauts of their time. They crossed thousands of miles of open ocean, colonizing Hawaii, Easter Island, Rapa Nui, and New Zealand, Aotearoa. They knew how to read the temperature of the water, the flight of birds, and the swell of the sea to find land. The legend says that Uiti Iranjora sailed south seeking new lands. He sailed past the storms. He sailed until the ocean grew cold and the color of the water changed. And then he saw something that defied description. The oral tradition describes it as Te Taiukapia. Translated, this means the sea frozen like arrowroot. Arrowroot is a starchy white powder. When mixed with water, it becomes a thick, white sludge. This is a startlingly accurate description of the grease ice or slush that forms on the surface of the ocean when it begins to freeze. The legend goes on to describe rocks that grow out of the sea, piercing the sky. It describes deceitful animals that dive deep, perhaps seals or whales. It describes a place where the sun has no warmth and the mist never lifts. Uiti Iranjora called this place the place of bitter cold. He did not stay. He turned his canoe around and sailed back to the warmth of the Pacific, warning his people not to go there. But did he land? If Polynesian navigators reached the ice edge in 650 AD, they saw the white Antarctica. They saw the fortress. But what if someone went earlier? We know that there were warm periods in the last 10,000 years, the Holocene climatic optimum, where the sea ice retreated. Is it possible that a daring crew of wayfinders landed on the coast of Antarctica? If they did, they would have found a desolate, rocky coast. But they might have left things behind. Stone markers, temporary shelters, tools. If we ever find a stone adze or a Polynesian artifact on the Antarctic Peninsula, it would rewrite history. It would prove that the human whisper reached the continent long before the Age of Discovery. But the Polynesians weren't the only ones close by in South America. The Yagan and Selknam people lived in Tierra del Fuego, the very tip of the continent. They were masters of the cold. They lived naked in freezing temperatures, coating their bodies in seal grease, keeping fires burning in their canoes. They were only 600 miles from Antarctica. The Drake Passage separates them. It is a violent stretch of water, but in rare periods of calm, could a canoe have drifted across? Could a storm have blown a fishing party south? There is no proof, but there are strange artifacts in the museums of Argentina, arrowheads and harpoons found on the southern islands that look remarkably similar to technologies found elsewhere. And then there are the maps we discussed earlier. The Piri Reis map, the Orontius Phineas map. If these aren't based on ancient high-tech surveys, could they be based on the oral reports of these early accidental explorers? Could the rivers on the maps be misinterpretations of glacial meltwater streams seen by someone who actually stood on the coast 1,000 years ago? The human whisper suggests that Antarctica wasn't invisible. It was a shadow on the edge of the human consciousness, a place of monsters, of white death, of the end of the world. But there is a deeper what if. What if the visitors didn't just see ice? What if, in some remote valley, or on some exposed nunatak, a mountain peak sticking out of the ice. They saw something that didn't belong to nature. Imagine a Polynesian wayfinder shivering in his canoe, looking up at a cliff face and seeing a line of stone that is too straight, a block that is too square that he wouldn't call it a ruin of a lost civilization. He would call it the work of gods or demons. He would paddle away as fast as he could. And when he returned home, the story would become a myth. The rocks that look like men, the temple of the white wind. We dismiss myths as fantasy, but myths are often just observations that we don't have the science to explain yet. The human history of Antarctica is usually told as a story of heroism in the 20th century. Scott, Shackleton, Amundsen. We treat it as a blank canvas that we conquered. But if the Silurian hypothesis is true, or if ancient mariners touched the ice, then Antarctica isn't a blank canvas. It is a palimpsest, a manuscript that has been written on, erased, and written on again. The silence of the continent is so profound that it amplifies these whispers. When you are there, the wind sounds like voices. The shifting ice sounds like footsteps. And as the explorers of the heroic age would find out, the mind creates its own monsters when faced with such emptiness. We are moving now from the legends of the Pacific to the hard, brutal reality of the first documented men to walk into the interior. We are going to look at the heroic age, not just as a race to the pole, but as a psychological confrontation with the ruins of the earth. They went looking for glory, but many of them reported feeling like they were trespassing, like they were walking through a graveyard that was watching them. Scott, Shackleton, Amundsen, they were the first to bring modern eyes to the ice, and what they saw and what they felt adds another layer to our mystery. Next, we enter the heroic struggle. When we talk about the discovery of lost civilizations, we usually picture archaeologists in sun hats brushing dust off golden idols. It is a warm, academic pursuit. But the first people to truly confront the interior of Antarctica were not looking for gold, and they certainly weren't warm. They were looking for the geographical pole, the abstract mathematical bottom of the world. This period, roughly from the late 19th century to the early 1920s, is known as the heroic age of Antarctic exploration. It is a story of wooden ships crushing in the pack ice, of men pulling sledges until their hearts gave out, of starvation, scurvy, and death. But if we look closely at the journals and diaries of these men, Robert Falcon Scott, Roald Amundsen, Ernest Shackleton, Douglas Mawson, we find something else. We find a profound sense of unease. We find a recurring psychological theme, the feeling that they were trespassing in a place that was not empty, but simply waiting. Antarctica does strange things to the human mind. It is a landscape of sensory deprivation. There are no smells. There are no sounds other than the wind and the ice. There is often no color other than white and blue. In a whiteout, the horizon disappears completely, and you float in a void where up and down become meaningless. In this void, the brain begins to fill in the gaps, projects, it creates. This brings us to the phenomenon of fata morgana, because of the extreme temperature inversions in Antarctica, where a layer of cold air sits below a layer of warmer air. Light bends in unusual ways. It creates superior mirages. Objects that are below the horizon are lifted up and stretched into towering shapes. Early explorers often reported seeing castles in the air. They saw jagged cities of spires, battlements, and towers floating on the horizon. They saw walls of ice that looked like fortifications. They saw islands that weren't there. Imagine being a sailor in 1900 exhausted, freezing, drifting through the pack ice. You look out and see a shimmering city of crystal rising from the sea. Is it a trick of the light, or is it a glimpse of the first civilization we have been imagining? Scientifically, we know it is refraction, but psychologically, it tells us something important. The human mind wants to find structure in the ice. We are desperate to see civilization. We project our own desire for meaning onto the chaos of the glacier. But sometimes, the hallucinations were more personal. One of the most haunting stories comes from Ernest Shackleton during his desperate march across South Georgia Island in 1916. After his ship, the Endurance, was crushed, and after a harrowing boat journey, he and 2 companions had to cross the glaciers of the island to find rescue. Shackleton later wrote that he had a distinct feeling that there were not 3 of them, but 4. He felt a presence walking with them. His companions confessed to feeling the same thing. This is now known as the third man factor, referencing T.S. Eliot's poem inspired by the event. What was that presence? Was it a neurological misfire caused by stress and dehydration? Or is Antarctica a place where the veil between the observer and the environment is thinner? If we entertain our Silurian hypothesis, the idea of a pre-human intelligence, perhaps the ghosts of Antarctica are not just metaphors. Consider the journey of Robert Falcon Scott. When Scott and his team reached the South Pole in January 1912, they found the Norwegian flag already there. Amundsen had beaten them. They turned back, broken-hearted. And then, the ice swallowed them. They died on the return journey, just 11 miles from a supply depot. In their final tent, as the blizzard buried them, Scott wrote his last letters. They are remarkably calm, but they speak of the awful grandeur of the place. When their bodies were found months later, they were not decomposed. They were frozen. The tent had become a tomb. Today, that tent is buried under tens of feet of snow. It is drifting slowly with the ice shelf toward the sea. In a few decades, it will break off inside an iceberg and float away into the ocean. Scott and his men have become part of the continent's archaeological record. If a future species digs them up in 1,000,000 years, they will be the mysterious artifacts. They will be the ancients preserved in the ice. This heroic age gives us a crucial data point for our investigation. It shows us how quickly the ice claims things. Scott's expedition built a hut at Cape Evans. It still stands today, preserved by the cold. Inside, there are tins of food, seal blubber, socks hanging on the line. It smells of 1911. It is a perfect time capsule. But it only survives because we maintain it. Without care, the snow would fill it. The wind would scour the wood away. The ice would crush it. The explorers also found fossils. In fact, when Scott's team was found dead, their sledge was still loaded with 35 pounds of rocks they had dragged from the Beardmore Glacier. Even facing death, they refused to abandon the science. Those rocks contained Glossopteris ferns, the proof that Antarctica was once green. They died dragging the evidence of the first Earth behind them. The heroic age was a collision between the modern human spirit and the ancient indifference of the ice. It proved that we could go there, but it also proved that we didn't belong there. We were visitors in hazmat suits of wool and fur, breathing air that wanted to kill us, and yet they kept going back. Why? Because of the blank spots on the map. Because of the suspicion that something was hiding in the pole of inaccessibility. As the 20th century moved on, the wooden ships were replaced by steel icebreakers. The The sledges were replaced by aircraft. The heroic age gave way to the mechanical age. And with the machines came a new kind of interest. Not just exploration, but strategy. Not just science, but military power. Rumors began to swirl in the late 1930s and 40s. Rumors of secret bases. Rumors that the Germans were interested in Queen Maud Land. Rumors that the United States was looking for something specific. This leads us to one of the most misunderstood and mythologized events in Antarctic history, Operation High Jump. In 1946, just after the devastation of World War II, the United States Navy didn't go home to rest. They assembled a massive fleet, an aircraft carrier, destroyers, submarines, and 4,700 men, and sailed south. Why send an armada to a frozen wasteland? The official reason was training, but the scale of it felt like an invasion. This is where the Fortress of Solitude begins to take shape. The transition from men dying in tents to men flying bombers over the ice cap, looking down with cameras, scanning for what we are about to enter the era of aerial photography, of anomalies seen from the sky, and of the persistent, nagging belief that someone else had claimed the ice before us. Let's step aboard the USS Philippine Sea. The wind is howling, the engines are turning, and Admiral Richard E. Byrd is staring out at the white horizon, preparing to launch a mission that will birth 1,000 conspiracy theories and, perhaps, reveal a few uncomfortable truths about what lies beneath. The year is 1946. The world is recovering from the most destructive war in human history. Cities in Europe and Asia are smoking ruins. But in the United States, a different kind of mobilization is happening. Admiral Richard E. Byrd, a national hero and the most famous polar explorer of his time, is given command of Task Force 68. The code name, Operation High Jump. This was not a small scientific party. It was an invasion force. 13 ships, including the aircraft carrier USS Philippine Sea, 23 aircraft, and nearly 5,000 personnel. They brought helicopters, seaplanes, and tracked amphibious vehicles known as alligators. They were dressed for war, but their enemy was the terrain itself. The sheer size of Operation High Jump has fueled decades of speculation. Why do you need an aircraft carrier to study penguins? Why do you need 4,000 Marines to map a glacier? Conspiracy theorists have had a field day with this. They whisper about New Swabia, the German expedition to Antarctica in 1938, and suggest that the US was going down there to root out a secret Nazi base hidden in the ice. They spin tales of UFOs attacking the fleet, of hollow earth entrances, of Admiral Byrd's secret diary describing lush lands beyond the pole. We must be careful here. As a channel grounded in facts, we have to separate the myth from the reality. There is no credible evidence of a Nazi base in Antarctica. The German expedition in 1938 was a whaling survey. They dropped metal darts with swastikas on them to claim territory, took some photos, and went home. They didn't build a fortress. And Admiral Byrd's secret diary is almost certainly a forgery created years after his death. But the reality of Operation High Jump is fascinating enough without the aliens. The US Navy went south because they were terrified of the Soviet Union. They realized that the next war might be fought over the North Pole, and they needed to know if their ships, planes, and men could function in deep freeze conditions. Antarctica was the perfect testing ground. But they were also mapping. They were looking for resources: uranium, coal, minerals. In a world depleted by war, a virgin continent was a prize. And during this massive mapping mission, they found something that felt like a glitch in the matrix. While flying over the coastline of East Antarctica, Lieutenant Commander David Bunger looked down and saw something impossible that he didn't see white. He saw brown. He saw blue. He saw green. He saw a landscape of bare, rocky hills, free of snow. He saw lakes of liquid water that were not frozen, glistening in the sun. He saw vibrant colors, reds and greens, in the water. He landed his seaplane on one of the lakes. The water was fresh. The temperature was mild compared to the surrounding ice. The red and green turned out to be algae. This was the discovery of the Bunger Hills, a literal oasis in the wasteland. To the pilots, it looked like a Shangri-La. It was a place where life could exist. It was a place that defied the big freeze. Now, apply our first civilization lens. If humans in 1947 could stumble upon a hidden oasis where the ice had retreated due to wind patterns and geothermal warmth, is it possible that similar oases existed in the deep past? Could the Bunger Hills be the type of location where a remnant population of our hypothetical ancients survived for a few thousand years after the rest of the continent died? The Bunger Hills are rocky and barren today, but if you were a refugee from the green forests, this is where you would go. Operation High Jump also revealed the limitations of our vision. The pilots flew thousands of miles, snapping tens of thousands of photographs. But when they developed the film, they realized a problem. Antarctica is hard to photograph. With no shadows, no trees, and no buildings, it is impossible to judge scale. A ridge might be 10 feet high or 1,000. A crevasse might be a crack or a canyon. This scale blindness leads to misidentification. It leads to people looking at blurry photos of nunataks, mountain peaks, and seeing pyramids. There is a famous mountain in the Ellsworth Range that looks exactly like a pyramid. It has sharp, triangular facets. The internet loves this mountain. It is often cited as proof of ancient engineering. But geologists know it as a pyramidal peak or a horn. It is formed when glaciers erode a mountain from multiple sides, sharpening it into a point. The Matterhorn in Switzerland is the same shape. It is nature mimicking architecture. However, Operation High Jump did confirm one thing. The coastline of Antarctica is not simple. It is riddled with inlets, caves, and overhangs. The ice shelf is a floating lid that hides the true coast. If there are ruins, they are likely under that lid. The mission ended abruptly after only a few months. The official reason was the early onset of winter and worsening weather. Of course, the abrupt departure only fueled the rumors of defeat by unknown forces. But the truth is likely more mundane. The Antarctic weather battered the fleet, destroyed aircraft, and killed a few men in accidents. The Navy realized that the ice was a more formidable enemy than they had calculated. Operation High Jump changed the game. It turned Antarctica from a place of individual heroism into a place of technological surveillance. After High Jump, the satellites came. And with satellites, we stopped looking with our eyes and started looking with sensors. We started peeling back the ice layer by layer. We started finding the anomalies. Gravity anomalies, magnetic anomalies, thermal anomalies, things that beep on a sensor but show nothing on the surface. This is where the modern mystery lies, not in stories of secret bases, but in the hard data that shows something massive and dense buried under the Wilkes Land crater, or the heat signature that suggests a volcano, or something else. Melting the ice from below, we are moving into the age of remote sensing. We are going to look at what the satellites see that we cannot. We are going to ask, If a civilization is buried there, would we see their buildings? Or would we see their pollution? Would we see the technosignatures frozen in the ice cores? The Fortress of Solitude is about to be scanned, and what comes back on the screen is not always just rock and ice. Join me as we ascend to orbit and look down with the electronic eyes of the 21st century. For most of human history, exploration was a tactile act. To know a place, you had to touch it. You had to walk the ground, breathe the air, and leave footprints in the snow. But in the late 20th century, our relationship with the planet changed fundamentally. We stopped looking at the horizon and started looking down from above it. The space age gave us a new set of eyes. Satellites circling the globe in silent orbits began to map the Earth with a precision that no cartographer on the ground could match. And when those electronic eyes turned toward the bottom of the world, they promised to strip away the secrets of the ice. But instead of solving the mystery of Antarctica, the view from space has often deepened it. It has created a modern mythology of pixelated shapes, shadows, and anomalies that fuel the belief that something is hiding in plain sight. If you have ever spent a late night scrolling through Google Earth, searching the white expanse of Antarctica, you are participating in a new kind of archaeology, armchair exploration, and you are not alone. Thousands of people scour these satellite images every day, looking for straight lines in a world of curves. Every few years, a new image goes viral. A perfect snow-covered pyramid standing amidst the mountains. A dark, square opening in the side of a cliff that looks like a hangar door. A shape under the ice that resembles a massive antenna or a crashed ship. The most famous of these is undoubtedly the Pyramid of the South. Located in the Ellsworth Mountains, it is a peak that possesses 4 distinctly triangular sides, rising to a sharp point. It looks undeniably artificial. It looks like the Great Pyramid of Giza, but draped in snow. To the imagination, this is the smoking gun. It is the evidence of the first civilization we have been looking for, a monument left behind by the ancient engineers. But geology is a master sculptor, and it often uses the same geometry as architects. Science calls this structure a glacial horn. It is formed when glaciers erode a mountain from 3 or more sides simultaneously. As the ice grinds away the rock faces, it sharpens the peak into a spire. The Matterhorn in the Alps is a classic example. The Antarctic Pyramid is a masterpiece of natural erosion, not masonry. The straight lines are the result of cleavage planes in the rock, fractures that break cleanly along geometric angles, and those hangar doors. They are usually shadows cast by overhanging ridges or artifacts of the satellite camera itself. When a satellite takes a photo of a white surface, the contrast is often blown out. A patch of dark rock or a deep shadow becomes a black void of pixels. Our brains evolve to find patterns, fill in that void with meaning. We see a door where there is only a hole. This phenomenon is called pareidolia. It is the same psychological quirk that makes us see faces in clouds or a face on Mars. In the desolation of Antarctica, where the landscape is alien and abstract, pareidolia runs wild. We want the ice to speak to us, so we translate the noise into words. However, not all anomalies can be dismissed as tricks of the light. Some are invisible to the eye but glaringly obvious to the sensors. In 2006, satellites measuring the Earth's gravity field, the GRACE mission, detected something massive buried deep beneath the ice of Wilkes Land in East Antarctica. Gravity is not uniform across the planet. dense rock pulls harder than light rock. A mountain pulls harder than a valley. By mapping these subtle pulls, satellites can see the density of the crust beneath the ice. What they found in Wilkes Land was a masscon, a mass concentration. It is a circular anomaly roughly 300 miles wide. Beneath the ice, there is a plug of something incredibly dense and heavy. The leading scientific theory is that this is the scar of a colossal asteroid impact, a crater more than twice the size of the one that killed the dinosaurs. If this theory holds, the Wilkes Land crater might be the grave of the Permian-Triassic extinction, the Great Dying that happened 250 million years ago. But consider the alternative, what if? If we are searching for the remnants of a civilization, we naturally look for ruins on the surface. But a civilization facing the big freeze might have built down. They might have constructed massive subterranean vaults, shielded by heavy metals or dense concrete, to survive the cold. Could a gravity anomaly of that size be artificial? It is highly unlikely. The energy required to build a structure 300 miles wide is beyond even our own capabilities. But the anomaly sits there, a heavy question mark. It is a reminder that beneath the smooth white sheet, the bedrock is scarred by violence and loaded with dense, unexplained materials. Then there is the radar. We mentioned the Gamburtsev Mountains earlier, found by seismic echoes. Today, we use ice-penetrating radar, IPR, flown on aircraft like the old DC-3s or modern Baslers. These planes fly back and forth, sending radio waves down through the ice. The waves pass through the frozen water but bounce off the rock below. The data they bring back is astounding. They have revealed the Grand Canyon of Antarctica, a rift valley deeper and longer than the Grand Canyon in Arizona, completely filled with ice. They have revealed the networks of subglacial rivers. But radar is not a photograph. It returns a profile, a squiggly line that represents the layers. Interpreting that line is an art. Sometimes the radar signal scatters. It gets fuzzy. This usually happens when the ice is warm and wet at the base. But it could also happen if the signal hits something that isn't rock. If there were a city of steel and glass buried down there, the radar return would be chaotic. It might look like noise in the data. How much of that noise has been filtered out by geologists looking for clean rock lines? We filter data based on what we expect to find. If we don't expect ruins, we might interpret a jagged, artificial signal as simply a rough patch of bedrock or a sensor glitch. The anomalies from above teach us a lesson about perspective. The view from space is powerful, but it is detached. It shows us the shape of the blanket, but not what is sleeping beneath it. We can see the pyramids that are mountains. We can see the craters that are gravity ghosts, but we cannot see the small things. We cannot see a tool, a bone, a wall, or a carved stone. The resolution isn't there. And the ice is thick. A mile of ice is a shield that blocks almost every frequency we throw at it.so. If we cannot see the structures with our eyes or our radar, perhaps we are looking for the wrong kind of evidence. A civilization is more than its buildings. A civilization is a metabolic process. Consumes energy. It burns things. It changes the chemistry of the air. And the air of the past doesn't vanish. It gets trapped, bubble by tiny bubble, in the ice itself. To find the true signature of a lost world, we have to stop looking at the pixels and start looking at the molecules. We have to enter the clean room of the laboratory, where scientists melt the ice cores and listen to the chemical ghosts of the atmosphere. We are moving from the telescope to the microscope, from the anomaly to the isotope. This is where the Silurian hypothesis faces its ultimate test. If you burn a piece of coal today, the smoke rises. It drifts on the wind. It seems to disappear, but it doesn't. The microscopic particles of soot, black carbon, and the molecules of carbon dioxide eventually settle. In the polar regions, they settle onto the snow. The next day, fresh snow falls on top of them. The layer is buried. Over millions of years, this process builds a vertical archive. The Antarctic ice sheet is not just a block of frozen water. It is a library of the Earth's atmosphere, organized by year, page by page, going back nearly 1 million years. This brings us to the most scientifically robust way to search for a lost civilization: the isotopic fingerprint. The Silurian Hypothesis, proposed by scientists Gavin Schmidt and Adam Frank, asks a fundamental question. If an industrial civilization existed millions of years ago, what would be left? Their conclusion was that buildings crumble and machines rust. But chemistry endures. A civilization like ours leaves specific marks. We release lead into the air from mining and gasoline. We release radioactive isotopes from nuclear tests. We create synthetic compounds like plastics and CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, that do not exist in nature. We alter the ratio of carbon isotopes by burning fossil fuels. If the first civilization of Antarctica existed, did they leave a chemical scar? The challenge with ice cores is time. The oldest continuous ice core we have retrieved from the Epoch Dome sea site goes back about 800,000 years. There are patches of blue ice near the mountains that might be as old as 1 or 2 million years. But remember, our green Antarctica existed 34 to 50 million years ago. The ice from that specific time is gone, melted or flowed into the sea long ago. The ice we have today is the new ICSO. Ice cores cannot tell us about the civilization that lived in the Eocene rainforests. For that, we need sediment cores from the ocean floor, like the ones we discussed in the subglacial lakes. However, ice cores can test the human whisper hypothesis. They can tell us if anyone was visiting Antarctica or operating near it in the last 100,000 years. And this is where things get interesting. In recent years, scientists analyzing ice cores from Antarctica have found traces of heavy metals that shouldn't be there. Lead in particular. Lead is the hallmark of metallurgy. When you smelt silver or copper, lead is released as a byproduct. It travels on the wind and settles on the ice. We have found clear spikes of lead pollution in Greenland ice cores dating back to the Roman Empire. The Romans smelted so much lead for their plumbing and coins that they polluted the Arctic atmosphere thousands of miles away in Antarctica. A study published in 2021 found traces of lead pollution reaching the continent as early as the late 19th century, coinciding with the Industrial Revolution in Australia and South America. But there are other, subtler anomalies. Some studies of black carbon, soot, in the southern hemisphere show spikes that predate the Industrial Revolution. Could these be massive forest fires? Almost certainly. The ancient world burned naturally. But distinguishing the smoke of a wildfire from the smoke of a foundry is a matter of isotopic precision. Forest fires release a specific ratio of carbon isotopes. Burning coal releases a different one. So far, the ice has not yielded a smoking gun of an advanced prehistoric industry in the last million years. We haven't found plutonium-244, which would indicate nuclear war. We haven't found a layer of microplastics dating back 50,000 years. But the absence of evidence in the ice cores is not the final word. It only tells us that if a civilization existed recently, geologically speaking, it wasn't a dirty civilization like ours. Maybe they didn't burn coal. Maybe they used geothermal energy, wind, or water technologies that leave a clean footprint. A civilization that lives in harmony with its environment is a nightmare for archaeologists because it leaves no trash dot or we go back to the sediment. The ANDRILL, Antarctic Geological Drilling Project, drills through the ice shelves into the mud of the ocean floor below. These mud layers go back tens of millions of years. They cover the time of the green Antarctica. In these cores, we see the chaos of the climate. We see the pulses of warm water, the sudden die-offs of algae. If we want to find the first civilization, this is where we must look. We need to look for a layer of mud from the Eocene that contains technofossils. Not just pollen, but perhaps a refined alloy, a ceramic shard, a concentration of rare earth elements that implies mining. The isotopic fingerprint is a search for the invisible. It is a forensic investigation of a crime scene that is millions of years old. And the scary part? We are currently writing our own layer. Right now, the snow falling on Vostok is trapping microplastics. It is trapping the carbon from our cars. It is trapping the radioactive fallout from Fukushima and Chernobyl. If we disappear tomorrow, and the ice continues to accumulate, a future geologist drilling a core 10 million years from now will hit a layer that screams civilization. They will see the spike in lead, the sudden jump in CO2, the radioactive dust. They will know we were here. The fact that we haven't found a similar layer from the deep past suggests one of two things. Either we are truly the first, or the ones who came before were so different, so clean, or so subtle that their chemistry blended back into the background noise of the planet. Perhaps they didn't conquer the Earth, they just lived on it. And in doing so, they evaded the isotopic trap. But the ice is changing. The eternal archive is beginning to leak. We are entering the final phase of our story. We have looked at the past, the green forests, the drift, the freeze. We have looked at the present, the anomalies, the maps, the cores. Now, we must look at the future, because the big freeze is reversing. The big melt has begun. And as the ice recedes, the secrets it has held for 34 million years are threatening to come to the surface. What happens when the eraser stops working? What happens when the tomb opens? We are going to the edge of the melting glaciers. We are going to look at the meltdown and what it might reveal. The clock is ticking not just for the climate, but for the mystery itself. For 34 million years, the ice has been the warden of Antarctica. It has kept the gates closed. It has sealed the library. It has ensured that whatever happened in the green valleys of the Eocene remained in the Eocene. The ice was a symbol of permanence, a white constant in a changing world. But permanence is an illusion. The geological clock has ticked forward, and the pendulum is swinging back. The warden is leaving its post. We are living in the era of the big melt. To climate scientists, this is a crisis. To the inhabitants of coastal cities, it is a threat. But to the mystery hunters, to those of us asking, what if? The melting of Antarctica is something else entirely. It is the turning of the page. It is the breaking of the seal. The ice sheet is not retreating quietly. It is screaming. If you stand near the calving front of the Thwaites Glacier, the so-called Doomsday Glacier in West Antarctica, you hear the sound of history breaking apart. It sounds like artillery fire, blocks of ice the size of skyscrapers are shearing off and crashing into the Amundsen as the ice pulls back. It reveals things that no human eye has ever seen. In February 2020, researchers on a ship off the coast of West Antarctica were looking at their charts. The map said there was nothing there but the Pine Island Glacier ice shelf. But when they looked out the window, they saw rock. The ice had retreated so quickly that it had exposed an entirely new island. Named Sif Island after the Norse goddess, it was made of volcanic granite. It had been buried, crushed, and hidden for who knows how long. And suddenly, there it was, a new piece of the puzzle, birthed from the melt. If an island can appear overnight, what else is waiting? Even more stunning was a discovery made in 2017 and published in 2020. Scientists drilling into the seafloor near the Pine Island Glacier, in waters that were previously covered by ice, pulled up a core that shocked them. They didn't find gray, lifeless mud. They found dirt. Specifically, they found a layer of ancient forest soil. It was 90 million years old, dating back to the mid-Cretaceous. But it was so well preserved that it still contained the fossilized roots of plants, contained pollen. It contained the chemical signature of a swampy, temperate rainforest. The lead researcher described it as unusual. That is an understatement. They had found proof that a mere 900 kilometers from the South Pole, there was once a forest as lush as New Zealand. The roots were still there, frozen in time, waiting for the ice to lift so they could tell their story. This brings us back to our central question. If the soil of the forest is still there, is the soil of the civilization there too? As the glaciers retreat on the Antarctic Peninsula, archaeologists are finding more and more. They are finding fossils of marine reptiles. They are finding evidence of the green Antarctica pushing further and further south. But there is a cruel paradox in the meltdown. Water is a destroyer. We mentioned earlier that cold-based ice preserves landscapes because it doesn't move. But melting ice creates water. Meltwater flows. It creates subglacial rivers that rush beneath the glacier with the force of a fire hose. As the Antarctic ice sheet melts, it lubricates the bedrock. The glaciers speed up. They grind harder, and the meltwater washes away the sediments. So we are in a race. The big melt is exposing the ground, yes, but it is also scrubbing it clean. If there are ruins of a first civilization, perhaps fragile structures of stone or compacted earth, the very process that reveals them might also destroy them. A sudden glacial outburst flood could wipe away a 50-million-year-old archaeological site in an afternoon, washing the evidence into the deep ocean before we even know it was there. This is the archaeological uncertainty principle of the melt. To see the past, we have to destroy the preservation mechanism. However, the melt is also changing the accessibility of the continent. Regions that were once impossible to reach are opening up. The dry valleys are expanding. Nunataks are becoming islands. We are entering a new age of Antarctic exploration. It will not be done by heroes on sledges or by pilots in the Cold War. It will be done by rovers, by drones, and by archaeologists scanning the newly exposed bedrock. We are already seeing this in the Arctic. As the permafrost melts in Siberia and Canada, it is vomiting up history. Ancient puppies, cave lion cubs, tools, viruses, bodies. The North is thawing and revealing its secrets. Antarctica is slower, colder, and older, but the process is the same. Imagine a day, perhaps 50 years from now, when the ice over the Wilkes Land crater thins enough for a sensor to get a clear picture. Imagine a drone flying over a newly exposed valley in the Transantarctic mountains and spotting a geometric pattern in the rock that is not a glacial horn, but a foundation. The meltdown is terrifying for the future of our civilization because of rising seas. But for the past of our planet, it is a moment of revelation. We are watching the white blanket being pulled back, and we are all holding our breath, wondering what is sleeping underneath. Is it just rock? Is it just fossils? Or is it the answer to the loneliness of our species? The ice is melting, the library is opening, and the final chapter of our story is about what we do with that knowledge. Because ultimately, the story of the first civilization is not about them. It is about us. It is about our fear of being forgotten. It is about our desire to be part of a longer story that, as the water drips from the edge of the Ross Ice Shelf, falling into the sea with a rhythmic, ticking sound, it reminds us that time is running out for the secrets of the South. And so, we come to the end of our journey beneath the earth. We have drifted, frozen, searched, and melted. What is left? Only the archive itself, the eternal, indifferent, patient memory of the planet. Let's wrap up this expedition with a final thought on the nature of deep time and our place within it. We have traveled a long way together tonight. We have walked through the steaming rainforests of the Eocene South Pole. We have watched the continents tear themselves apart in the Great Drift. We have shivered as the first snows of the Big Freeze turned a paradise into a tomb. We have traced the impossible lines on ancient maps and listened to the ghostly echoes of radar bouncing off mountains that shouldn't be there. And through it all, we have asked one haunting question. What if we are not the first? The Silurian Hypothesis, the idea of a forgotten industrial civilization, remains, for now, a hypothesis. We have not found the golden city under the ice. We have not found the nuclear waste of the ancients in the sediment cores. The smoking gun remains elusive. But the absence of evidence, as we have seen, is not the evidence of absence. It is simply a testament to the power of the Great Eraser. Antarctica teaches us humility. It teaches us that the Earth is not a stage built for humans. It is a vast, complex, and violent machine that has been running for 4.5 billion years. We have only been on stage for the last few seconds of the play. To assume that we are the only ones who have ever spoken, built, or dreamed is a kind of arrogance that the geology of the planet does not support. The ice sheet is a mirror. When we look into its white void, we see our own fears. We fear the cold. We fear the silence. But mostly, we fear being forgotten. We build our skyscrapers of glass and steel. We write our books. We upload our lives to the digital cloud, all in a desperate attempt to say, I was here. We want to leave a mark that lasts. But Antarctica shows us that even a continent can be erased. Even a rainforest can be turned into a desert. Even a world can be buried. If a civilization did exist beneath the ice, they likely felt just as permanent as we do. They likely looked at their cities and thought they would stand forever. They likely worried about their politics, their wars, and their daily lives, never suspecting that a shift in the ocean currents would seal their entire history in a block of ice for 30 million years. And if they are down there, preserved in the time capsules of Lake Vostok or the frozen rose valleys of the Gamburtsevs, then they are the ultimate message to the future. They are a warning and a promise. The warning is that nothing lasts. Entropy wins. The ice always comes back. The promise is that the Earth remembers. The planet is an eternal archive. It writes everything down. It writes in the language of isotopes, in the alphabet of fossils, in the ink of sedimentation. It may hide the pages for a while. It may bury them under miles of ice or sink them to the bottom of the ocean. But it never truly throws them away. We are currently writing our own page in that archive. We are leaving a layer of plastic, of carbon, of concrete. Millions of years from now, if a new intelligence evolves on this planet, perhaps returning to the green continent of Antarctica after the next great cycle, they will dig down. They will hit the Anthropocene layer. They will find our isotopic fingerprint. They will wonder about us, just as we wonder about the ancients. They will ask, what if there was a civilization here before the great changes? They will be the new mystery hunters, and we will be the mystery. So are the ruins of the first civilization beneath Antarctica. Maybe. The continent is vast, and we have scratched less than 1% of it. The radar anomalies, the map oddities, the sheer logic of the green Antarctica all leave the door open. As the ice melts, that door opens wider every year. But perhaps the answer isn't the most important part. The most important part is the wondering, because in wondering we expand our minds. We step out of the small box of the present and connect with the deep, immense timeline of our home, that we realize that we are part of a lineage of life that is tenacious, creative, and enduring. Whether we are the first, the second, or the 10th, we are part of the Earth story. And the Earth keeps its stories safe. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, think of the silence of the South. Think of the wind howling over the polar plateau, guarding the secrets below. Think of the dark lakes waiting in the deep. The ruins may be there, sleeping in the cold, or they may be gone, recycled into the mantle. But the mystery remains. And as long as there is mystery, there is a reason to keep exploring, to keep asking, and to keep looking beneath the surface. Thank you for journeying with me into the white silence. It is a cold place, but I hope you found some warmth in the curiosity we shared. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the impossible history of the world, and if you want to be part of our little expedition into the unknown, please consider giving this video a like. It helps the signal reach further through the noise. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Mysteries Beneath Earth. We have many more layers to peel back, many more maps to read, and many more stories sleeping in the stone. Until next time, keep your eyes open, keep your mind wide, and remember, the past is never truly gone. It's just waiting for the thaw. Good night.